I would like to wish everybody a very good afternoon, today, and I'm very pleased to be invited to present my paper on the ASEAN steel industry and what has been going on all this time at the Kallanish Asia Steel Markets virtual conference. My name is Wee Jin. I'm the Secretary General of Southeast Asia Iron and Steel Institute. And the paper will cover the following topics. Before we start that, so this is a quick introduction about SEAISI. We are 50 years old this year. We've got about 900 members from 27 countries with an employee base of about 400,000. So SEAISI is for the steel industry, by the steel industry in ASEAN. Today's presentation will cover a few of these topics here. As you can see, the first one is on the ASEAN economies amid COVID-19, followed by the impact on the ASEAN steel industry, and then we'll move on to the developments and the forecast for 2021. So here we are. This is the current situation of the pandemic in ASEAN. The status is, as you can see, the challenges is still going. ASEAN countries' success in containing the COVID-19 pandemic is actually very mixed. So some countries are keeping the pandemic under control, but for some of the other countries, challenges remain. You can see from this slide that challenges continue to remain in Indonesia and Philippines, and also in Malaysia. Whereas for the other three countries in ASEAN 6, that are Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam, the pandemic is becoming quite well controlled. Although there are sporadic instances of so-called outbreaks here and there, especially in Thailand, which is threatening the economy at the moment. Right. So this is the situation that is going on in ASEAN. The next slide is a very detailed slide, but it tells you exactly when the lockdowns and when the various measures have been put in place. And this is one slide that will explain fully the impact on the country's economy, construction, and manufacturing during that period of time. Now, this slide is a slide that shows what has the countries introduced to control the pandemic, right? You can see here on this particular slide, you see the countries and a timeline of lockdown. From the picture, you need to look at the bottom right-hand corner where you can see the severity of lockdown, 5 being the most severe and down to 1 being the least severe. Right. So what you can tell from this slide is basically the most severe actions in terms of lockdown in the country actually happens in the Philippines. Right. So 3 countries in this region have very severe lockdown. Philippines number 1, number 2 is Malaysia, number 3 is Singapore. Right. The other countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam did not impose a very severe lockdowns in their ways of trying to control the pandemic, right? So, and you can see from this particular slide is that from March, April, and May is a period of time where you see a lot of dark colors on the slides, and those are the period of time that you can see very, very severe lockdown in the country. Various countries. So what happens after this? You see from the economic results, which will eventually show that the second quarter of the year, 2020, is actually the worst performing quarter in the entire year, right? Okay, so towards the end of the 2020, you can see that the colors of the various bars are getting lighter. Simply means that the various restrictions are being relaxed. And now and then you also see that a lot of resurgence of cases coming back, especially in Philippines, Indonesia, and also Malaysia, which of course is part of the reasons why the economies are slowing down. Right. So the next slide is on how the ASEAN economies are doing. These are the impact. You can see from this slide, the first thing to look at is the green bars. The green bars you can see are all very negative numbers, right? And the green bars actually show you what happens in the quarterly GDP numbers in the quarter 2 of 2020. Right, so you can see that the worst numbers you can see from Malaysia, which is minus 17.1% contraction in quarter 2. For Philippines, it's 16.9. Singapore is 13.3. Thailand 12.2. Of course, the best performing country here in terms of economic activity is Vietnam. Vietnam has registered a positive growth all the way in 2019 and 2020. Right. So the final result that we have from the countries is on the last row, where you can see Vietnam registering a growth of 2.9%, whereas for the other countries, they're all at a very big negative rate, except for Indonesia, which is only a contraction of 2.1%. Right. So this is how ASEAN economies are doing in terms of GDP. If we were to look at the next slide, which shows construction activities, what is interesting here again is you can see on the right side, the Vietnam numbers are all positive. Having been able to control the pandemic very well, the country has managed to continue their construction activities, although it's slower because of the various restrictions due to the pandemic. So as you can see here again, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore have got very severe construction industry contraction, even down, to the level of 60% in the second quarter of last year. Right. Again, you can see the biggest negative numbers come from the countries that have imposed the most severe lockdowns in the region. Right. Remember, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam did not impose any of those lockdowns. Okay, so again, for 2020, you can see the numbers down there at the last line. Vietnam construction industry grew 6.8% for 2020. Indonesia, a slight reduction at 3.3. Thailand is also positive at 2% growth. And the rest of the country, you can see double-digit contraction in terms of construction activities. The next slide here shows you the automotive industry. Now, in ASEAN, the biggest sector for consumption of steel is actually construction, and the second one is automotive. Right, and you can see from this particular slide is that the automotive industry has been pretty badly hit due to the pandemic, in particular around March, April, May period, where you see only about 51,000 vehicles were produced in ASEAN. Right, the typical rate is 330,000 vehicles for most of the time. So it has dropped down in a very big way. So they say automotive industry is actually the biggest victim of the pandemic, right? So you can also see from this particular slide, after the pandemic hit, the numbers have gone down very dramatically, but eventually towards the end of the year, production have kind of caught up. So on the whole, even though the numbers have gone up, production has gone up, but still the figures for 2020 is still about 30% below the 2019 figures. Right. So the third largest consuming sector for steel is the manufacturing sector. Again, you can see from here the green columns for quarter 2 of 2020, and you can see that again for Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, there has been a severe lockdown, and therefore the industry contracted during that period. What was interesting that has happened so far is you can see again Vietnam continues to register positive growth in manufacturing activities throughout 2019 and 2020. Right, you can see from Singapore numbers that after a contraction in the second quarter, a slight contraction, manufacturing activities actually became very positive, and they grew about 10% in quarter 3 of 2020 and 9.5% in quarter 4 of 2020. Similarly, if you look at the case of Malaysia, third and fourth quarter of 2020 saw manufacturing sector growth as well, although a bit smaller, about 3%. And what has happened in these two countries is that they have been exporting a number of products, typically electronic products, precision engineering products, as well as pharmaceutical products. So those are the exports that are in demand in the ASEAN region. Okay, so impact on the ASEAN steel industry, as you can see from this case, the ASEAN steel consumption, for 2020, we estimate to be around 70 million tons, which is about 12.4% decline from 2019 of about 80 million tons. Okay, right. So it's a major drop, which we have not seen in many years. Right. So okay. So let's take a look at this one now. What do we see here in terms of production and imports? The interesting point is here. During the pandemic, we see a huge increase in production, which is at 6.5% in 2020. Right. We also see a major drop in imports in terms of net imports in this case of about 36.1%. Okay. So the next slide here shows you the imports of steel into ASEAN. You can see in the very last set of columns, the ASEAN steel imports have reduced from 51.2 million to 41.9 million in 2020. That is a decrease of 18.2%. Right. However, on the other, if you were to look at exports, which is on this slide, you can see from the very last set of columns on the right, is that even due to the pandemic, even during the pandemic, ASEAN has been exporting a lot of steel materials around the globe. Right. So what is interesting about this slide is to point out a couple of things. So number one is a number of exports in ASEAN came from new investments that has been so-called set up in the various countries. Like for example, in Indonesia, the export jump came from increase in capacity. Krakatau POSCO for plates, Tsingshan Steel for stainless steel products. In Malaysia, it's mostly for Alliance Steel and other players because of long products overcapacity in the market. And for Vietnam, you can see that the jump in export is due to the setting up of Formosa Hatin at that point in time. So they are able to export hot rolled coils around the region. Right. So this is a very interesting slide that shows you that even though capacities have come up in the individual countries, there is still need for export out of those countries. Right. So this is the steel export numbers here. Now let's take a look at some very quick developments and forecasts for 2021. Now the economic recovery for ASEAN actually depends on many factors. And there's a lot of uncertainties because there are so many factors in there. And we also wonder, how long exactly will it take for the countries to achieve pre-pandemic levels? So the recovery in the case of the ASEAN steel industry comes from the major points here. Number one is the control over the pandemic. You can see that 3 countries have controlled the pandemic well. The other 3 are still facing challenges. Progress of vaccination, which has barely started, so it will continue. Kickstarting the economies, is another major issue. Governments have been committed to grow the economies, to recover the economies through public sector investments, and these are mostly for infrastructure projects. For those countries that would like to be able to tap on private funds, they have actually set up public-private partnerships to run private projects. Right. So some of the countries like Indonesia, for example, have reduced restrictions on investments, hoping to be able to bring more FDIs into the country. And a number of countries are also looking at encouraging domestic tourism by funding, subsidizing local travel. Okay, so everybody is hoping for an export market recovery and eventually the opening of borders. of course, of late, there are also political uncertainties in certain countries, which may hamper their economic recovery, right? So a very quick look at how ASEAN is going right now. You can see from the map here is that the countries have certain forecasts. Like Vietnam has forecasted 6 to 6.5% growth for 2021. IMF projection is 6.5%, right? So you can see that a lot of countries are projecting very high growth rates, coming from a severe drop in 2020, right? So Malaysia 6.5 to 7.5%, Singapore 4 to 6%, Indonesia 4.5 to 5%, and Thailand is the lowest one at 2.8%, right? So basically, what is going on in ASEAN is that most countries have targeted to vaccine the bulk of the population by first quarter of 2022. There's a lot of effort being put into public construction works. Either the government will put in public infrastructure investments, or they have public-private investments. This is for Vietnam in particular. There are still challenges remaining for construction sector due to various COVID-19 restrictions put in place and the lack of migrant laborers for a number of countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. Right. So ASEAN countries are also trying to revive other parts of their economies, like funding the domestic travel, and any efforts to open borders remain cautious and not in a sense very impacting at the moment, right? In the meantime, global impact of backlog in shipping operations, as well as the rise in steel prices because of raw materials. So these two things may hamper economic recovery efforts in the meantime. So we need to monitor this as we go along. Right. So at the end, my last slide here basically tells you that based on what has been going on in ASEAN so far, from 2020 consumption or demand of 70 million tons of steel this year in 2020, last year, we will expect the 2021 forecast to be around 72 to 75 million tons. Okay, so that's all I have for my presentation today. I'd like to thank everyone for your attention, and I would like to thank Kallanish for inviting me to present in your event. Thank you very much.